In World War II, 34,000 people were saved by a man who had no medical training. Not a doctor, not a scientist, not a commander. He was a combat officer who used math. In April 1945, Allied forces liberated Nazi concentration camps. The world calls it a moment of victory. But inside the camps, something horrifying happened. People kept dying, not from violence. From treatment, doctors did everything right. Clean water, proper food, correct medical protocols, and hundreds died every single day. Here is the paradox. The safer the doctors tried to be, the faster people died. Medical experts reached a grim conclusion. If nothing changed, tens of thousands would die even after liberation. Not because help was missing, but because the system was working exactly as designed. Then one man looked at the numbers and saw something everyone else missed. Staying meant a 12% chance of death every day. Moving meant risk, but far less. So he asked a forbidden question. What if following medical rules was more dangerous than breaking them? What followed was not a miracle. It was not heroism. It was a calculation. And that calculation saved 34,000 lives. Liberation is supposed to be the end of suffering. In history books, it is drawn as a clean line before freedom and after freedom. But in the spring of 1945, that line did not exist. When Allied forces entered the camps, they expected trauma, starvation, disease. What they did not expect was that death would accelerate after the gates were opened. The camps were no longer killing people. The environment was. Bodies that had endured years of deprivation were suddenly exposed to food, water, warmth, and medical care, the very things meant to save them. And for many, those things arrived too fast, too concentrated, too late. This was not chaos. It was order. Military medical units were among the most disciplined systems in the world. They followed protocols refined through decades of war. These rules existed for a reason. They prevented shock. They reduced complications. They saved lives on battlefields from North Africa to Normandy. Everything happening in the camps followed those rules. Food was introduced slowly. Water was controlled. Patients were treated individually. Disease was isolated where possible. From a medical standpoint, nothing was being done recklessly. And yet, every morning, the numbers climbed. Men and women who had survived forced labor, starvation, and brutality collapsed hours after receiving their first proper meals. Their bodies, hollowed by months of deprivation, simply shut down. Hearts failed. Digestion stopped. Infections spread faster than treatment could reach them. This was not because the medicine was wrong. It was because the situation was. The medical system had been designed to save patients. But these camps did not contain patients. They contained populations, tens of thousands of people sharing contaminated space. Overcrowded barracks where disease traveled faster than footsteps. Limited airflow, limited sanitation, limited time. Treating people one by one, the gold standard of medicine, became a fatal bottleneck. Doctors worked continuously, often 20 hours a day. They treated as many people as possible, as carefully as possible. But for every patient stabilized, several more deteriorated beyond recovery. The math refused to cooperate. If 400 people died today, and 400 more tomorrow, then treatment was not failing occasionally, it was failing structurally. Within days, senior medical officers began doing what they were trained to do when outcomes contradicted expectations. They reviewed charts, they adjusted feeding schedules, they altered treatment order, they requested more supplies, more personnel, more time. None of it changed the curve. The death rate remained brutally consistent. Eventually, the unspoken question surfaced in command tents and medical briefings. What if this is the best we can do? This was not defeatism. It was realism. Medical doctrine had limits, and those limits were being reached. Even with perfect discipline and unlimited effort, projections showed that tens of thousands would die simply because their bodies could not recover fast enough inside the environment they were trapped in. This conclusion was horrifying and medically sound. Under these conditions, extreme mortality was considered unavoidable. That was the consensus. And consensus is powerful. It ends debate. It stabilizes decisions. It allows systems to function even in tragedy. But consensus also hides something dangerous. It assumes that the framework itself is correct. No one questioned whether the camps themselves, even after liberation, were incompatible with survival. No one asked whether staying put was the most dangerous option of all. Because asking that question required abandoning a foundational belief of medicine. That moving critically ill people is almost always worse than keeping them stable. This belief was not superstition. It was supported by data. Transport causes stress. Stress kills weakened bodies. Ambulances exist to move patients short distances, not entire populations across war-torn roads. So the camps became static hospitals, and static hospitals became slow-motion mass graves. This was the paradox at the heart of the crisis. The safer the doctors tried to be, the more people died. The system was not cruel. It was precise. It was doing exactly what it was designed to do and producing outcomes no one could accept. It took someone outside the medical hierarchy to see the flaw. Someone who did not think in terms of patients, but in terms of percentages. Someone who looked at death not as a tragedy to be minimized emotionally, but as a variable to be reduced mathematically. The moment that question was asked, the entire logic of treatment began to unravel. Because if staying meant certain death for thousands, then movement, however dangerous, was no longer reckless. It was rational, and that realization would force a decision that broke every rule designed to save lives. Systems exist to prevent chaos. In war, they are built to function under pressure, to remove emotion from decision-making, and to replace instinct with procedure. Military medicine was one of the most disciplined systems ever created. It saved countless lives by doing one thing extremely well: reducing uncertainty. Protocols existed so that no doctor had to guess. Rules existed so that no decision depended on panic. Training existed so that outcomes could be predicted. In ordinary combat conditions, this system worked. In the camps, it became lethal. The medical response followed a familiar pattern. Patients were assessed individually. The most critical cases were treated first. Feeding schedules were conservative. Water intake was carefully controlled. Disease was managed through isolation where possible. From the outside, it looked like control. From inside the camps, it felt like suffocation. Every step required paperwork. Every adjustment required approval. Every movement required justification. This was not bureaucracy for its own sake. It was safety. The system assumed that stability was always preferable to disruption, that keeping people in place, minimizing stress, and controlling variables reduced risk. But the camps were not stable environments. They were amplifiers. Disease spread faster than doctors could isolate it. Overcrowding turned minor infections into outbreaks. Limited space meant limited airflow. Limited airflow meant contamination never dissipated. Each day, the system treated hundreds of individuals and left tens of thousands exposed to the same lethal conditions. The bottleneck was not effort. It was throughput. Medical teams could only process so many patients per hour. The camps contained far more bodies than any field hospital was designed to handle. Even perfect efficiency could not overcome the scale. As death counts rose, leadership demanded explanations. Doctors responded with charts. They showed calorie intake curves, hydration schedules, treatment success rates for individual patients. All of it was correct. All of it was irrelevant. The system was answering the wrong question. Instead of asking, "How do we save this person?" And then, quote, the real question was, "How do we stop this place from killing everyone?" But systems resist reframing. They are optimized to refine, not reinvent. So the response intensified. More supplies arrived. More personnel were requested. More tents were erected. Still, the death rate held steady. At this point, something subtle happened. Responsibility began to shift. Deaths were no longer framed as preventable failures. They were framed as tragic inevitabilities, the delayed consequences of Nazi crimes, not Allied decisions. This distinction mattered. If deaths were inevitable, then no one was at fault. If no one was at fault, then no one needed to change the system. The numbers became background noise. 400 deaths per day stopped being a crisis and became a statistic. It was discussed in briefings with the same tone used for fuel shortages or weather forecasts. This was not indifference. It was psychological survival. No system can function if it treats every loss as a moral catastrophe. so it converts suffering into data and moves forward. But data has a way of exposing contradictions. When mortality projections were extended forward, the conclusion was unavoidable. If current conditions continued, tens of thousands would die under Allied supervision, not because of malice, not because of neglect, but because the camps themselves remained incompatible with recovery. The system reached its limit. And at that limit, it chose preservation over disruption. Preservation of protocol, preservation of hierarchy, preservation of professional identity. Because to admit that the entire framework was wrong would mean admitting that everything done so far, every careful treatment, every cautious decision, had contributed to mass death. That was a truth no system is eager to face. So the safest conclusion became the official one. This is terrible, but unavoidable. We are doing everything that can be done. That sentence ended debate. And it might have ended thousands of lives, because the system never asked one dangerous question. What if the camps themselves were the primary cause of death? What if medicine wasn't failing but being applied in the wrong place? The problem wasn't how people were treated, but where. This question did not come from medical textbooks. It did not come from training manuals. It did not come from expert consensus. It came from someone who was not invested in protecting the system. Someone who did not speak the language of protocol, but the language of outcomes. He did not see patients. He saw rates. He did not see risk as something to be avoided. He saw risk as something to be compared. To the system, movement was danger. To him, immobility was already fatal. The camps were killing people at a measurable, predictable pace. Once that pace was understood, stability stopped being safety. It became exposure. And that realization shattered the assumption holding the entire response together. If staying meant certain death for thousands, then movement, even dangerous movement, was no longer reckless. It was the only variable left to manipulate. The system had exhausted every option that fit inside its rules. What came next would require stepping outside them. And once you step outside a system designed to protect life, you are no longer protected by it. The point did not come from a dramatic speech or a moral appeal. It came from arithmetic. While doctors debated protocols, one officer began counting deaths, not symbolically, not emotionally, precisely. Each morning brought a new total. 400 dead, then 400 more. The number barely fluctuated. It was consistent enough to become predictable. Consistency is comforting to systems. It is terrifying to individuals. Because consistency meant this was no longer chaos. It was a process. If 400 people died today, and 400 tomorrow, then this was not a temporary spike. It was a stable rate of failure. The officer did not ask why people were dying. That question had already been answered. Disease, starvation, shock, overcrowding. Instead, he asked a more dangerous question. How many would die if nothing changed? The answer was straightforward. At the current rate, tens of thousands would be dead within weeks. Then he asked a second question, one the system avoided. What if people were moved? To the medical establishment, the answer was obvious. Movement kills the critically ill. Transport causes stress. Stress triggers shock. Shock kills weakened bodies. This was not theory. It was taught on the first day of medical training. You stabilize patients before you move them. You do not transport populations of dying people across damaged roads in the middle of a war. That would be reckless. But recklessness depends on comparison. So the officer compared. Staying meant exposure to disease, overcrowding, and contamination, a daily mortality rate approaching 12%. Moving meant stress, disruption, and risk. But risk that could be estimated. He did not need perfect outcomes. He needed better ones. If transport killed 3%, but staying killed 12%, then remaining in place was 4 times more dangerous than movement. This was not intuition. It was probability. The math was brutal and simple. Every day of delay cost hundreds of lives. Every day of movement, even imperfect movement, saved them. This reframing changed everything. Doctors thought in terms of individual patients. He thought in terms of distributions. Doctors tried to eliminate risk. He tried to minimize loss. Doctors asked, what could go wrong? As, he asked, compared to what? Well, we are all of the place, end quote. When this calculation was presented, it collided head-on with medical orthodoxy. Moving critically ill patients was considered malpractice. Doing it deliberately, at scale, bordered on madness. The room reacted exactly as systems do when confronted with logic that threatens their foundation. Dismissal, ridicule, outrage. This officer had no medical credentials, no authority to challenge doctrine, no experience treating patients. He was asking trained professionals to abandon rules that defined their identity. To accept his math would mean admitting something intolerable, that the system itself was causing death. Not through cruelty, through correctness. The resistance was immediate. Transport would kill people. Roads were damaged. Vehicles were limited. Weather was poor. Patients would die en route. All of this was true. None of it addressed the calculation. The officer did not claim movement was safe. He claimed staying was worse. That distinction mattered. Eventually, the debate shifted from morality to numbers. If the idea was wrong, it would fail quickly. If it was right, it would save lives immediately. So a compromise was reached. A test, not a theory, not a simulation. A real-world experiment with real people. A small group of the sickest patients would be moved to nearby facilities, buildings with space, air, and separation from contamination. The results would be measured objectively. No speeches, no ideology, just outcomes. The preparation revealed the next layer of the calculation. Movement alone was not enough. It had to be controlled. Patients needed fuel before transport. Food was distributed in precise amounts. Water was rationed carefully. Transport was slow, deliberate, and monitored. Vehicles moved at walking speed. Medical staff traveled alongside patients. Stops were planned, not improvised. This was not evacuation as panic. It was evacuation as engineering. Every variable that could be controlled was controlled. Then the movement began. The journey was brutal. Roads were uneven. Vehicles were inadequate. Some patients died. That was expected. What mattered was comparison. When the numbers were tallied, the result was unmistakable. Mortality during movement was a fraction of the death rate inside the camp. The math held. Staying was killing more people than movement ever could. This was the moment the system could no longer look away. The calculation had done something no argument could. It stripped the decision of emotion, ideology, and professional pride. What remained was a choice between two outcomes, one clearly worse than the other. For the first time, movement was not framed as danger. It was framed as mitigation. Once that shift occurred, the logic became unstoppable. If moving hundreds saved lives, then moving thousands would save more. If moving some was acceptable, then not moving all became indefensible. The calculation did not promise perfection. It promised reduction. And in a disaster of this scale, reduction was salvation. At that moment, medicine stopped being about rules and became about consequences. The question was no longer whether the idea was risky. The question was how many lives were lost every hour it was not implemented. Breaking the rules now meant something very specific. It meant accepting responsibility for action instead of hiding behind procedure while people died. The decision that followed would redefine what medical success looked like in catastrophe. Not survival without risk, but survival despite it. And once that line was crossed, there was no going back. The calculation was accepted. The problem stopped being medical. It became logistical. Saving lives no longer depended on better diagnoses or new treatments. It depended on trucks, roads, schedules, calories, and space. Medicine could stabilize bodies. Logistics had to keep them alive. The scale was overwhelming. Tens of thousands of people needed to be moved out of an environment that was killing them, not eventually, but daily. Every delay translated directly into deaths. This was not evacuation in the traditional sense. There were no clean corridors, no dedicated transport fleets, no modern infrastructure. What existed was whatever could be found. Military trucks captured from the enemy, abandoned ambulances, civilian buses left behind in the chaos of retreat. Vehicles designed for equipment were repurposed for human beings. The first rule was simple: speed kills, slowness saves. Convoys moved at walking pace, not because it was efficient, but because efficiency was irrelevant if patients died en route. Every jolt mattered. Every sharp turn mattered. Every pothole was a risk. Inside each vehicle, the priorities were brutally basic. Warmth, hydration, calories, not comfort, not dignity. Survival, patients were wrapped in blankets. Hot water bottles were pressed against frail bodies. Food was measured and distributed in small, frequent portions. Water was rationed precisely, not generously. There was no room for improvisation. Improvisation creates variability. Variability creates death. Each truck became a moving equation. Load too many people, and heat and disease spread. Load too few, and time was wasted. Routes were chosen not for speed, but for smoothness. Schedules were planned not around daylight, but around human tolerance. This was not medicine practiced at a bedside. It was medicine practiced across maps. The destination mattered as much as the journey. People were not moved randomly. They were dispersed. Schools, factories, barracks, warehouses, any structure with walls, air, and separation became a hospital. The critical variable was space. In the camps, dozens of people shared rooms designed for a handful. Air stagnated. Disease lingered. Recovery was impossible. In the new locations, each person received something radical. Distance. Distance between beds, distance between breaths, distance between infections. This was not advanced medicine. It was environmental control. Once people were separated, something remarkable happened. Basic treatment started working. Fevers broke. Infections slowed. Bodies stopped collapsing under constant assault. Nothing about the medicine had changed. Only the surroundings. This was the revelation logistics delivered. Health was not being restored by drugs or procedures. It was being restored by space. The operation expanded rapidly. Moving hundreds turned into moving thousands. Each day added new routes, new destinations, new supply chains. Food deliveries had to arrive on time. Water had to be clean. Medical staff had to rotate. Any failure cascaded. If a truck broke down, patients waited longer. If food arrived late, bodies weakened. If space ran out, disease returned. Every decision carried a cost measured in lives. This was not heroism. It was pressure. 20-hour workdays became standard. Sleep happened between convoys, inside vehicles, on cold floors. Planning never stopped. Adjustments were constant. There was no finish line, only the next day's death count. The numbers became the only metric that mattered. Inside the camps, death had been steady and relentless. Outside, it began to fall. Not to zero. Never to zero, but lower. Then lower again. Each reduction validated the logic. Movement worked. Not perfectly, not safely, but better. The medical establishment watched the results with discomfort. This approach violated everything they had been taught. Patients were supposed to be stabilized before movement. Treatment was supposed to be centralized, controlled, orderly. Instead, chaos was being replaced with controlled disruption. The trucks did not look like hospitals. The buildings were not designed for care. The system was improvised, and yet it was saving lives. This forced a painful realization. The old system had not failed because it lacked resources or expertise. It failed because it optimized the wrong variable. It optimized caution. This system optimized survival. Logistics, often dismissed as secondary to strategy or medicine, became the primary life-saving force. Where medicine had reached its limit, logistics created room to breathe, literally. By dispersing people, by breaking concentration, by trading stability for motion, the operation rewrote the definition of treatment. Treatment was no longer something done to a person. It was something done around them. Space became medicine. Movement became therapy. Each successful day raised the stakes. If the operation continued, tens of thousands would live. If it failed, responsibility would be unavoidable. There would be no hiding behind protocol, no citing of doctrine, no shared blame. Only outcomes. And outcomes were now visible. The camps were emptying. The death rate was dropping. The calculation was holding. But systems do not collapse quietly. As the operation grew, resistance intensified. Questions began to surface. Who authorized this? Who approved the use of enemy vehicles? Who decided to move patients against medical advice? Success does not protect rule breakers. it exposes them. The more lives were saved, the harder it became to justify how it was done. Because if this worked, then it meant something unsettling. It meant that following the rules had not only been insufficient, it had been dangerous. The system would have to respond, and systems respond to disruption in predictable ways. The next phase would not be logistical, it would be political. Systems tolerate failure more easily than they tolerate disruption. As long as people were dying quietly under established procedures, responsibility was diffuse. No one individual could be blamed. The system absorbed the loss. But once the death rate began to fall, attention followed. Success created visibility. Visibility created questions, and questions threatened authority. The operation had grown too large to ignore. Vehicles were being requisitioned without formal approval. Enemy equipment was being repurposed. Prisoners of war were being used as labor. Patients were being moved against explicit medical recommendations. Each of these actions violated established rules. Together, they formed a challenge to the entire chain of command. From the perspective of headquarters, this was not innovation. It was insubordination. Orders were written to prevent exactly this kind of behavior. Military systems rely on predictability. Unauthorized decisions create liability. Liability creates chaos. The same logic that had made medical protocols rigid now turned against the operation itself. Questions arrived faster than supplies. Who authorized the transports? Who approved the dispersal sites? Who accepted responsibility if something went wrong? There were no good answers. Because the operation had been designed to move faster than permission. If approval had been sought at every step, people would have died waiting. That was the entire premise of the calculation. But speed has a cost. As scrutiny increased, so did pressure. Senior officers demanded explanations. Medical authorities filed complaints. Logistics officers questioned resource allocation. The accusations were not emotional. They were procedural. You are not trained for this. You exceeded your authority. You endangered lives. You created an unsanctioned medical system. All of it was technically correct. The system was not attacking outcomes. It was attacking process. Because outcomes are dangerous to debate, processes are easier to control. For the individual at the center of the operation, the risk became personal. If the transports failed, there would be no ambiguity. Deaths during movement would be attributed directly to his decisions. There would be no shelter in protocol, no shared blame. The system had rules for this. Courts-martial existed for less. This is where many challenges die, not because they are wrong, but because the cost of being right becomes too high. Every day, the operation continued. The stakes increased. If it stopped, thousands would die. If it continued and failed, careers and freedom would be lost. The pressure was relentless. Medical professionals argued that success so far was luck, that early gains would be erased by a single outbreak or accident, that established hospital ships and rear area facilities existed for a reason. They were correct about one thing. If a convoy crashed, if disease spread through a satellite site, if supply lines broke, the operation would collapse instantly. There was no redundancy. No safety net. Traditional systems survive by absorbing failure slowly. This one could not afford failure at all, yet the numbers kept speaking. Each day, mortality remained far below what it had been inside the camps. Not perfect, but dramatically better. This forced an uncomfortable comparison. The system had demanded caution. Caution had produced mass death. This operation demanded risk. Risk was producing survival. The contrast made neutrality impossible. At this point, leadership faced a choice. They could shut the operation down to reassert control and accept the consequences. Or they could allow it to continue and admit that established doctrine had failed. Neither option was acceptable. So the response became ambiguous. No official endorsement. No formal shutdown. The operation continued under a cloud. This ambiguity was intentional. If it succeeded, leadership could claim it was sanctioned. If it failed, responsibility would be isolated. This is how systems protect themselves. The individual executing the operation understood this clearly. There would be no medals waiting, no public praise, only risk. So the focus narrowed. Everything became about maintaining momentum. Convoys ran continuously. Routes were adjusted hourly. Supply shortages were patched with improvisation, became optional. Mistakes became unacceptable. The margin for error shrank with every passing day. The pressure was not heroic. It was exhausting. No speeches, no triumph. Only the next set of numbers, and the numbers still favored movement. As the days passed, something else changed. Opposition softened, not because critics were convinced, but because the evidence was undeniable. Deaths were down. Recovery rates were up. Facilities outside the camps were stabilizing. Even the most skeptical observers struggled to argue against the trend. The system began to do what it always does when faced with undeniable results. It adjusted its narrative. This was no longer a reckless gamble. It was an innovative response to a temporary adaptation. Hinabound. An exception under extraordinary circumstances. Enter. Language shifted. Credit was redistributed. Responsibility blurred. But the risk did not disappear. Any single failure could still reverse everything. The operation existed in a narrow window between success and catastrophe, and that window was closing. The final phase would determine whether this approach would be remembered as a dangerous anomaly or become something more. Because systems forgive outcomes. They do not forgive challenges to authority unless those challenges rewrite the rules themselves. What came next would decide whether this operation would vanish into obscurity or quietly change how lives were saved in disasters forever. History has a strange way of absorbing disruption. When something works too well, systems rarely admit they were wrong. Instead, they rewrite the outcome until it fits comfortably inside existing doctrine. That is what happened next. As the evacuation continued, the numbers stabilized. Mortality dropped dramatically compared to the days immediately after liberation. The camps, once death traps even in freedom, began to empty. The improvised facilities, scattered, under-equipped, and imperfect, did what centralized hospitals could not. They gave people space to recover. From the outside, it looked like order had been restored. Inside the system, something else was happening. Reports were written. Language was adjusted. Responsibility was redistributed. Official documents described improved coordination, better supply distribution, and innovative medical responses. The focus shifted away from the decisions that broke protocol and toward the outcomes that preserved authority. The system learned, but quietly. There were no ceremonies for the rules that were abandoned, no acknowledgments that standard practice had failed, no public reckoning with the fact that doing everything correctly had nearly cost tens of thousands of lives. Instead, the lesson was folded into doctrine. Years later, new evacuation guidelines appeared. They emphasized rapid dispersal, decentralized facilities, medical care during movement rather than before it. These ideas were presented as evolution, not rebellion. The origin story disappeared. This was not malicious. It was institutional survival. Systems do not like to remember moments when outsiders expose their limits. They prefer continuity. They prefer to appear as if progress was inevitable. But progress is never inevitable. It is forced. The logic proven in those weeks did not remain confined to one place or one war. It reappeared whenever catastrophe overwhelmed established systems. In later conflicts, evacuation became faster. Hospitals became mobile. Treatment began en route, not after arrival. Helicopters replaced trucks. Tents replaced buildings. But the principle remained unchanged. Move people out of killing environments first, then treat them. The same logic appeared beyond battlefields. In refugee crises, overcrowded camps were broken apart. In epidemics, isolation was achieved through dispersion rather than containment alone. In disasters, logistics became as important as medicine, yet the most important lesson was rarely stated explicitly. The danger was not ignorance, it was orthodoxy. Every system is built on past success. What worked before becomes rule. Rule becomes identity. Identity becomes resistance to change. That resistance is not evil, it is human. Doctors followed protocols because protocols had saved lives. Commanders enforced hierarchy because hierarchy had prevented chaos. No one involved was cruel or incompetent, and that is what makes the lesson so uncomfortable. The greatest danger in catastrophe is not bad intentions. It is good intentions applied without questioning context. When conditions change faster than doctrine, correctness becomes lethal. This story is often misremembered as one of heroism, one man against the system, courage in the face of authority. That interpretation misses the point. The real conflict was not between individuals. It was between scale and design. Medicine was built for patients. The crisis demanded population-level thinking. Once that mismatch was exposed, someone had to choose: follow rules and accept mass death, or break rules and accept responsibility. That choice is never comfortable, and it is never rewarded immediately. In most systems, the safest position is compliance. If things go wrong, you are protected. If things go right, the system takes credit. Breaking that pattern requires something rare: not bravery, not genius, but a willingness to be blamed, the willingness to stand alone if outcomes turn negative, the willingness to let numbers judge decisions rather than reputation, the willingness to say, "This is killing people," even when everyone else insists it is correct. That willingness saved lives in 1945, and it remains relevant. Because modern systems are larger, faster, and more complex, but no less rigid. Protocols still exist. Expert consensus still dominates. Lists still replace judgment in moments of pressure. Most of the time, that is a good thing. Until it isn't. Until conditions break the assumptions those systems were built on. When that happens, the most dangerous phrase in any organization is the same one heard in those camps: "This is the best we can do." And if wise, sometimes it is true. Often, it is convenient. The lesson of this story is not that experts should be ignored. It is that expertise must remain adaptable. Rules save lives until they don't. And when they stop working, someone has to notice. Not emotionally, not ideologically, but mathematically. Because numbers do not care about reputation, hierarchy, or tradition. They only reflect reality. In those weeks, arithmetic exposed a truth no system wanted to face. That inaction was deadlier than risk. That stability was more dangerous than movement. That following the rules was the fastest way to lose thousands of lives. This is not a comfortable legacy. It does not fit neatly into narratives of progress or professionalism. It does not celebrate institutions. It warns them, because the next catastrophe will arrive with different conditions, different variables, and different victims. And when it does, the question will return. Not whether the rules are correct, but whether they still apply, and whether someone will be willing to challenge them before the numbers make the decision irreversible.